I'm back. I had a 24-hour Facebook jail thing go because I used 3 words. I killed them, just those words. The robotic algorithm said you're off for 24 hours. But I was talking about, it was a conversation. We were talking about roaches, roaches and flies and cockroaches. And those 3 words just happen to be in there. But we're back. Tarzan and the Apes. We're on chapter 21, The Village of Torture. All right. And there's only 28 chapters. And I'm pretty sure if I remember correctly that Tarzan ends up going to the mainland before the book's over. This isn't it. Village of Torture. I have a feeling this is Mbonga's tribe and all that. All right, here we go. As the little expedition of sailors toiled through the dense jungle, searching for signs of Jane Porter, the futility of their venture became more and more apparent, but the grief of the old man and the hopeless eyes of the young Englishman prevented the kind-hearted D'Arnaud, he's the Frenchman, from turning back. He thought that there might be a bare possibility of finding her body, or the remains of it, for he was positive that she had been devoured by some beast of prey. He deployed his men into a skirmish line from the point where Esmeralda had been found, and in this extended formation, they pushed their way, sweating and panting, through the tangled vines and creepers. It was slow work. Noon found them but a few miles inland. They halted for a brief rest then, and after pushing on for a short distance further, one of the men discovered a well-marked trail. It was an old elephant track, and D'Arnaud, after consulting with Professor Porter and Clayton, decided to follow it. The path wound through the jungle in a northeasterly direction, and along it, the column moved in a single file. Lieutenant D'Arnaud was in the lead and moving at a quick pace, for the trail was comparatively open. Immediately behind him came Professor Porter, but as he could not keep pace with the younger man, D'Arnaud was 100 yards in advance of him, when suddenly a half-dozen black warriors rose all about him. D'Arnaud gave a warning shout to his column as the blacks closed in on him, but before he could draw his revolver, he had been pinioned and dragged off into the jungle. His cry had alarmed the sailors, and a dozen of them sprang forward past Professor Porter, running up the trail to their officer's aid. They did not know the cause of his outcry, only that it was a warning of danger ahead. They had rushed past the spot where D'Arnaud had been seized when a spear hurled from the jungle transfixed one of them, and then a volley of arrows fell among them. Raising their rifles, they fired into the underbrush in one direction from which the missiles had come. But this time the balance of the party had come up, and the volley after volley was fired toward the concealed foe. It was these shots that Tarzan and Jane Porter had heard. Lieutenant Charpentier, who had been bringing up the rear of the column, now came running to the scene, and on hearing the details of the ambush, ordered the men to follow him, and plunged into the tangled vegetation. In an instant, they were in a hand-to-hand fight with some 50 black warriors of Mbonga's village. Arrows and bullets flew fast and thick. Queer African knives and French gun butts mingled for a moment in savage and bloody duels, but soon the natives fled into the jungle, leaving the Frenchmen to count their losses. 4 of the 20 were dead, a dozen others were wounded, and Lieutenant D'Arnaud was missing. Night and falling rapidly, and their predicament was rendered doubly worse when they could not find the elephant trail which they had been following. There was but one thing to do: make camp where they were until daylight. Lieutenant Charpentier ordered a clearing made of a circular abatis of underbrush constructed about the camp. This work was not completed until long after dark, the men building a huge fire in the center of the clearing to give them light to work by. When all was safe, and possibly against attack of wild beasts and savage men, Lieutenant, gotta make sure I get his name right, Charpentier placed sentries about the little camp, and the tired and hungry men threw themselves upon the ground to sleep. The groans of the wounded mingled with the roaring and growling of the great beasts, which the noise and fireflight had attracted, kept sleep except in its most fitful form from the tired eyes. It was a sad and hungry party that lay through the night long praying for dawn. The blacks who had seized D'Arnaud had not waited to participate in the fight which followed, but instead had dragged their prisoner a little way through the jungle and then struck the trail further on beyond the scene of the fighting in which their fellows were engaged. They hurried him along, the sounds of battle growing fainter and fainter as they drew away from the contestants until there suddenly broke upon D'Arnaud a vision, a good-sized clearing at one end of which stood a thatched and palisaded village. It was now dusk, but the watchers at the gate saw the approaching trio and distinguished one as a prisoner ere they reached the portals. A cry went up within the palisade. A great throng of women and children rushed out to meet the party, and then began for the French officer the most terrifying experience which man can encounter upon the earth: the reception of a white prisoner into a village of African cannibals. To add to the fiendishness of their cruel savagery was the poignant memory of still crueler barbarities practiced upon them and theirs by the white officers of that arch hypocrite Leopold II of Belgium, because of whose atrocities they had fled the Congo Free State, a pitiful remnant of what once had been a mighty tribe. They fell upon D'Arnaud tooth and nail, beating him with sticks and stones and tearing at him with their claw-like hands. Every vestige of clothing was torn from him, and the merciless blows fell upon his bare and quivering flesh. But not once did the Frenchman cry out in pain. He breathed a silent prayer that he be quickly delivered from his torture. But the death he prayed for was not to be so easily had. Soon the warriors beat the women away from their prisoner. He was to be saved for nobler sport than this, and the first wave of their passion having subsided, they contented themselves with crying out taunts and insults and spitting upon him. Presently they reached the center of the village. There, D'Arnaud was bound securely to the great post from which no live man had ever been released. A number of the women scattered to their several huts to fetch pots and water, while others built a row of fires on which portions of the feast were to be boiled, while the balance would be slowly dried in strips for future use, as they expected the other warriors to return with many prisoners. The festivities were delayed, awaiting the return of the warriors who had remained to engage in the skirmish with the white men, so that it was quite late when all were in the village, and the dance of death commenced a circle around the doomed officer. Half fainting from pain and exhaustion, D'Arnaud waited from beneath half-closed lids what seemed but the vagary of delirium or some horrid nightmare from which he must soon awake. The bestial faces, daubed with color, the huge mouths and flabby hanging lips, the yellow teeth, sharp-filed, the rolling demon eyes, the shining naked bodies and cruel spears. Surely no such creatures really existed upon the earth. He must indeed be dreaming. The savage, whirling bodies circled nearer. Now a spear sprang forth and touched his arm. The sharp pain and the feel of hot, trickling blood assured him of the awful reality of his hopeless position. Another spear and then another touched him. He closed his eyes and held his teeth firm set. He would not cry out. He was a soldier of France, and he would teach these beasts how an officer and a gentleman died. Tarzan of the Apes needed no interpreter to translate the story of those distant shots. With Jane Porter's kisses still warm upon his lips, he was swinging with the incredible rapidity through the forest trees straight toward the village of Mbanga. He was not interested in the location of the encounter, for he judged that would soon be over. Those who were killed, he could not aid. Those who escaped would not need his assistance. It was to those who had neither been killed nor escaped that he hastened, and he knew that he would find them by the great post in the center of Mbanga village. Many times had Tarzan seen Mbanga's black raiding parties return from the northward with prisoners, and always there were the same scenes enacted about that grim stake beneath the flaring light of many fires. He knew, too, that they seldom lost much time before consummating the fiendish purpose of their captures. He doubted he would arrive in time to do more than avenge. On he sped. Night had fallen, and he traveled high among the upper terraces where the gorgeous tropic moon lighted the dizzy pathway through the gently undulating branches of the treetops. Presently he caught the reflection of a distant blaze. It lay to the right of his path. It must be the light from the campfire the two men had built before they were attacked. Tarzan knew nothing of the presence of the sailors. So sure was Tarzan of the jungle knowledge that he did not turn from his course, but passed the glare at a distance of a half a mile. It was the campfire of the Frenchmen. In a few minutes before Tarzan swung into the trees above Mbanga's village, he was not quite too late. Or was he? He could not tell. The figure at the stake was very still, yet the black warriors were still pricking at it. Tarzan knew their customs. The death blow had not been struck. He could tell almost to a minute, how far the dance had gone. In another instant, Mbanga's knife would sever one of the victim's ears. That would mark the beginning of the end, for very shortly after a writhing mass of mutilated flesh would remain. There would still be life in it, but death, then, would be the only charity it craved. The stake stood 40 feet from the nearest tree. Tarzan coiled his rope. Then there rose suddenly above the fiendish cries of the dancing demons the awful challenge of the ape man. The dancers halted as though turned to stone. The rope sped with singeing whir above the heads of the blacks. It was quite invisible in the flaring lights of the campfires. The unknown opened his eyes. A huge black standing directly before him lunged backward as though felled by an invisible hand. Struggling and shrieking, his body rolling from side to side, moved quickly toward the shadows beneath the trees. The blacks, their eyes protruding in horror, watched, spellbound. Once beneath the trees, the body started rising up, straight into the air, and as it disappeared up into the foliage, the terrified Negroes, screaming with fright, broke into a mad race for the village gate. The unknown was left alone. He was a brave man, but he had felt the short hairs bristle upon the nape of his neck when that uncanny cry rose upon the air. As a writhing body of the black soared, as though by unearthly power, into the dense foliage of the forest, the unknown felt the icy shiver run along his spine, as though death had risen from a dark grave and laid a cold and clammy finger on his flesh. As the unknown waited the spot where the body had entered up into the tree, he heard the sounds of movement there. The branches swayed as though under the weight of a man's body. There was a crash, and the black came sprawling back down to earth again to lie very quietly where he had fallen. Immediately after him came a white body, but this one alighted erect. The unknown saw a clean-limbed young giant emerge from the shadows and into the firelight and come quickly toward him. What could it mean? Who could it be? Some new creature of torture and destruction, doubtlessly. The unknown waited. His eyes never left the face of the advancing man, nor did the other's frank, clear eyes waver beneath the unknown's fixed gaze. The unknown was reassured, but still without much hope, though he felt that face could not mask a cruel heart. Without a word, Tarzan of the Apes cut the bonds which held the Frenchman. Weak from suffering and the loss of blood, he would have fallen, but for the strong arm that caught him. He felt himself lifted from the ground. There was a sensation as of flying, and then he lost consciousness. The end. It's a shorter chapter, which I like. The next one's chapter 22 will be the search party. I'll get to it as soon as possible. Thank you, and good night.